All right, so as far as textures for all of the pieces in the environment, I've now moved forward from test lighting 17 to 22. In the end, meaning that I went through 5 different saves as I textured the environment, because nothing else really has changed inside here. So if I go into Maya, we're at 17. And so let's just go in here. And so, yeah, so from test lighting 17 up through 24, you can see 24 is the last file before I start moving on to some of the effects here being the locusts. And so if we move forward, the file that we opened in Photoshop was based on this scene 22. So let's confirm that. So Photoshop 22. And so open that. And so in here you can see now the character is hidden and the environment's visible, since that's what I'm working on. And so the characters are sitting there on his own layer. And so for texturing this, it's pretty much similar to what I did for the character, because again, texturing an environment with this many pieces, you could easily spend a month on it, and I didn't want to. And so since I'd already kind of blocked out the lighting, and so let's just go back to Photoshop for that. If we go back to an earlier render of the environment, let's say without the character in it, and without whatever that little streaky glow stuff is, because we'll talk about that stuff later. This is where my environment is at right now with my blocked out lighting. The point lights inside there, the area lights inside the pits, and a couple directional lights. So we can see our main light coming down that's kind of representing the sky or moon or whatever, and then a fill directional light bringing some light into these dark areas. And so since the image is relatively dark, and I kind of still wanted the environment to look like everything in there is rock or stone or maybe some bone, uh, which rhymed, sorry. If I move forward from this one to this one, let's say this render, what's the change? Well, the change is my cavity maps. And so at this point, we can see the cavity maps that I have inside here are a little high contrast. When I go to this render, you can see the lighting has basically stayed the same for the most part. I've just now introduced new cavity maps all over the place. And so let's just go and take a look. So they're still in there, but they're far more subtle. And so basically they are accentuating detail without looking so hand-drawn. And so we can see if we look in certain areas. Now I'm at 100% right now, so if I zoom in, it's going to get a little pixelated. But, you know, it just creates a nice sort of like grunge to all of the objects, making them look weathered. And since they just have a blin on them with a low specular color, so the specular highlight's not very bright, and a high eccentricity or big eccentricity, meaning that the highlights kind of spread out, and the color is gray, it gives me kind of a stony appearance to it. It's just, the thing is with stone is that it's not a flat gray, it's got some texture or hue or color or value variation to it. But the cavity map is an important start point. And so you can see like in the ground and here that that cavity map is just accentuating things. So even though nothing's textured, with the lighting being blocked out, it made me realize that all I really need to do is just break things up a little bit. You know, export my UV snapshots, import some textures of rock, and then multiply my cavity maps into those, and hopefully that would give me a pretty good start point for texturing this environment. Because in the end, it is pretty dark. You know, there's a lot of dark values inside here. So as I move forward to this one, here you can see the main difference is that the lighting has been tweaked a little bit further. The lighting in the pit is now a little bit stronger. My fog is also a little stronger inside here. Or actually, I rendered this one without it, so now my fog is on. But again, we'll do a separate chapter to talk about fog. And the next render inside here, just tweaking the lighting a little bit. So you can see the angle of the light in there has changed. I was just experimenting. And so I ended up liking this one better just because this one feels a little flat. like meaning that the left wall and the right wall look the same in this area. If I look at this one, this one's more in shadow while this one's more in light. And then here you can see is a layer of just the foreground where I've started to throw some textures on it. And then here we can see we've got textures applied to everything. So for the textures, if I zoom into 100%, then you can clearly see inside here that if we go back to pre-texturing where everything is gray, once I get the textures on there, it just makes things look a little bit more realistic just because colors are being broken up. So we can see the fact that like this is a little bit reddish and this has, a little bit of a dark spot on it. A couple areas where, I would need to fix the seam because of the UVs. So like things like that little dark, let me just make this a little smaller. So things like, let me just go and make it easier to point out. That, where like the color is getting a little darker inside there, or the fact that the little horns there are a little bit of a darker gray. It's all just about breakup. But the cavity maps are the big thing that are multiplied into the color maps to make things work a little bit better. So again, like for the base of this column, if we look at it before, it was just a flat gray. And so once it's textured, it kind of looks, it's clearly the same form with the same cavity map. It's just we see a little bit of orange there, a little bit of yellow there. But it's not a painstakingly made texture, I think is my point. It's just something that I need breakup. So if we look at this column here, you can see that it's just very, very consistent. While in this one we have like, this dark area here and little spots, spludges and whatever. So it's textured, it's not final fog and final lighting and stuff, which is why it's still, looking a little funky, but things are just being blocked out. So how was this approached? So basically I went in, let's go and close that, and if we go and open some of our texture PSDs, which are again all in my texture directory, you can see that let's go and take a look at it based on date modified. So in the end, you can see that I started texturing this thing, fingernails, pit bones, to 729, and then basically that's the scythe and the torso, which means I made further tweaks of the character textures. So 8-1. So basically from, over the course of about 3 days, I textured the environment. And so if we start with one of the first ones, let's say the pit bones, this is one that I wanted to look bony. And when I say pit bones, I'm referring to these. Then this, you can see how really simple it is. I've got, this is a base. So the big thing is finding good textures that I think will work as a base coat. And so for this one, I knew that I was going to need a 4K texture because they're close to camera. So I grabbed a texture that I liked, which you can tell inside here is this. It was a tileable texture from one of the Gnomon Workshop texture libraries because those are pretty high res. I repeated it 4 times inside here and then grabbed my cavity map for the pit bones, plopped it in here, set to multiply, just so I can get it darker in the nooks and crannies, and then brought it in again, set to color dodge with an HSV node on it, just like I did for the character. And so it gave me kind of a weathered, bony look in those regions without having to spend a lot of time on it. So often I'll just try and texture things as fast as I can and get textures on everything. And then when I'm kind of done with everything, I can sort of scan over the entire composition to find problems. So instead of trying to be anal over every single piece, it's just like block it out and then fix the things that are sort of sticking out as issues. And so in here, though, with these 2 cavity maps, so this one, let me just put both of these to normal. So normal at 100%, and then this one, let me put it to normal at 100%. But an important thing to point out here is notice that here, this one is the actual cavity map, that I set to multiply and then lowered the opacity on, so that the nooks and crannies get a little darker. But then this one is a blurred version of the cavity map. And so then that one set to color dodge, and then with the HSV node on it, which we can see is adjusting the hue, saturation, and lightness, and also colorizing it. So you can see I could darken that down a little bit, adjust saturation and hue. And so in the end, by having a blurred version of it, it just means that I'm adding an overall tint based on elevation, higher points and lower points, but it's not going to be grabbing that tinting and all the tiny little grooves. So by blurring it, it's just an overall change. And the two together worked out. So that's the texture for those. So let's go and move back. Let's go and open this render again, just so we can see what those were looking like. So they clearly, feel textured, but it was a very, very fast process. So it has a kind of a cool bony look to it. You can see a little UV border right there. And so let's look at some other textures. So the pit bones, then you can see I went to the front stairs. And so if we look at the UVs for this, so I don't have the UVs inside here, but I have a cavity map. So front stairs are the stairs right there. And so you can see this one, I just grabbed a texture and adjusted levels on it, and then looks like I used that one, not that one. Set to multiply at 50%, my cavity map. So that's a pretty lazy texture job. Island middle. So this is the side here. Let's go back out here. That is this surface. We can see inside here I've got, we turn all this stuff off. Again, a base texture that I've repeated. This one is a 4K map just because the island middle, if this is a 6K render wide, then this is filling up a lot of space horizontally, so it would need a 4K texture. So repeated this in, so it has a lot of detail to it, and then color corrected it to the color I wanted for the ground. Brought in my cavity map, as you can see in here, set to multiply at a very low opacity. Adjusted levels on the cavity map, and then put the cavity map on top of that again to further accentuate it. So generic ground with some breakup. All right, so island middle. The pit, which is we don't really see much. Island middle left, you can see it's kind of the same thing. Island left, island tip. Since all of these island pieces are just ground, you can see I'm using the same base texture in the background. And for these, I'm using the color map as color and as bump, and probably a spec as well, since I don't have spec broken up, just again to be lazy. Because by using the same map as color and bump and spec, it reduces how many textures I'm loading in, reduces how much RAM I'm using. So I'll always try that first for background elements just to see if it looks okay before making customized specs. So while for the character, a foreground thing, I made a customized spec. For some of the environment things, I didn't care so much. So inside here, if I had some of the things that are in, base color, adjust levels, and then this is clearly just an area on the island tip where I wanted to have the rocks be a different color. So specifically the island tip is all the way back there, so the rocks that are right along that edge, that's what that is. So I wanted those to be a different color. Add a little bit more grime in here, as you can see. So the Gnomon Workshop texture library has lots of PSDs where the alpha is already pulled for them, so it's easy to grab those to crunch things up. Did an HSV, and then multiply in the cavity map, adjust levels again, and put the cavity map on top. So again, simple thing, which in Paul Campion's texturing DVDs that he did, he refers to this as 2-minute textures, meaning you're just banging things out really fast, just trying to cruise along, and then fix things later. And I think that's kind of a good term, because you can kind of tell that's what a lot of this is. But in the end, it looks all right. So island middle, the road, so road bottom and road top. So if I open the road inside here, meaning the pathway that's on the island, we can see, let me just get rid of that. Again, I have a base. So for this, you can see I used a different base, but then I went in and colored, corrected it. So I went in and all the rocks that are along the road, so meaning on the pathway, let's use a different camera. So meaning the rocks that go along here, I wanted them to be a different color, so that's what this represents. Then I'm layering in another map, overlay at 71%. Then just bringing in a little bit of grime on those rocks. Adjusting contrast so they're lighter colored on the rocks. And then bringing my cavity map in from ZBrush, and then an adjustment layer on top of everything. And so at 100%, this is what the texture for the ground looks like. So you'll see that I'm using layer masks a lot. So here I define that layer mask, and then if I want to apply one of these textures inside here, just inside that area, I've already created a layer mask, so I just copy the layer mask from one layer to the other. And that's that one. Island middle, ground front. Let's do it chronologically. Island right, the bridge. So this one, hide this. Here's my base. Overlaid in this texture. So I'm kind of reusing, you can see the same textures on a lot of these maps just for consistency. And so, you know, by grabbing like 4 or 5 or 6 high-res base textures that I keep using, things hopefully will unify. Although this one you can see I brought in a different texture and plop that in with my cavity map just for the sides. And with that cavity map inside there, just getting some breakup. And I should say that for each one of these things, as I make these textures in Photoshop, then to save out a flattened version, I would then just, save as a copy, turn off layers as a TIFF file to my source images directory. So you can see here's where all my textures are. Save it out, and then in Maya, I've got my shader that would be applied. So let's say on this guy. So let's go and say select material from object. So I can find the material that's on the bridge. We can see it has a displacement map from ZBrush. It has a normal map from ZBrush. But then it has the color map that I created in Photoshop. Right there. And so that color map you can see is just going into color. On the bridge, I ended up not using it in bump. And this shader, you can see, is just a blend, no reflectivity, dark specular color and then a relatively large eccentricity, so the highlights kind of spread out, so it's not too shiny. And again, that's just as I'm blocking out my textures, I just have a basic shader. Because again, once I get all the textures blocked out and do a render, I can start seeing where do I need to fix textures and where do I want to tune the shader or tune a spec map, stuff like that. So let's say we look around a little bit more. Let's say we look at some of the columns. So second floor column. So again, a base coat. We've seen this texture before. HSV it, just to make it a little bit muted. Bringing in a multiplied cavity map. Bringing in a color dodged cavity map. So you can see it looks like this and then like that, accentuating the details, and then a little bit of grunge and grime in there. And for this cavity map here, if I put it to normal, put it to 100%, this one actually isn't a cavity map, this is an ambient occlusion map that I rendered from ZBrush. So when you're masking, you can mask by ambient occlusion or you can mask by cavity. So on this one, I masked by ambient occlusion and then saved that mask to a texture and exported it. While this one right here is obviously just a cavity map. So by blending cavity maps and ambient occlusion maps together, you can shade your model in interesting ways in your texturing process. Although that one was set to multiply. Okay. Let's look around some more. But I think at this point you get the idea, hopefully, that from a technical perspective, the way that I texture is pretty straightforward. Here's some of the walls. Here are the spikes that are on the second floor rail. You can see I used a wood texture as the base. And so what this is these are those spikes up there. Just thought I'd make them a little bit more interesting. So, finding a base texture. So I guess that's a big part of it, is finding a texture intuitively that I think is going to work just by browsing my texture library. I have a massive texture library. It's like, 50 or 70 gigs of textures. I've been collecting, anybody who makes a texture library, I tend to grab it and just build my texture library. I have lots of photos that I've shot. I've got the Nomen Workshop ones, and I've spent so many years browsing that texture library, I kind of know where stuff is. And so desaturate it, bring in the cavity map, multiply it, bring in the cavity map, color dodge it, and there you go. I've got an interesting looking texture where I've rotated the wood grain to match the direction that these things were going, and it kind of creates a kind of neat looking texture that has a very organic, bony, weathered, bony feel to it. And I think I'm not going to open every single one. So I'm just going to look through here just to see. Like there's the third floor rail. So on this one you can see I use that same texture inside these. So you can see it's pretty much the same process. You can see I tried a couple different ones. So what I was saying earlier actually is that I export these from Maya and import these textures from Photoshop, import them to Maya, and I have my render view open. So I'll be doing test renders of the textures I'm creating in Photoshop as I'm creating them. So I'll tweak the texture in Photoshop, bring it into Maya, do a test render, see if I need to change something, go back to Photoshop, I could change. So I go back and forth between Photoshop and Maya as I'm resolving these textures, as you would probably expect. And then obviously creating layer masks for some of these things. And you can see there's the cavity maps in there. And that is how I textured the environment. The little horn that's on the bridge. Simple enough. So if we now go back to this render, After a couple days, I basically have the textures for the environment blocked out, so that now it obviously feels textured as opposed to before, where it's all just clearly a uniform gray. So it's all pretty much using the same shader for the most part, a blend, but once I throw textures in there on color, or some of them maybe I'd use it on color and bump, it just creates a very much more organic breakup inside here. But it was done super fast. So that's pretty much it for how I textured the character, the scythe, and the environment. It then became a process of trying to unify all this stuff together. So I would, tweak shaders here and there a little bit by adjusting the specular color or by adjusting the reflectivity, although on most things I left reflectivity off. And then trying to unify things through the use of some environment fog and finalizing lighting. So the next thing to do with this inside here, let's just go back to Photoshop, is I guess we can talk a little bit about the fog effects that are in the environment. So let's do that.